book is one heck of a read. I've got to tell you, everyone I've gotten the book for, I gave it to some people as Christmas present, and they came back and said I couldn't put that book down. It was really it's because it really draws you in. It's very well written and informative, and one of the things I love is the inclusion of transcript from offenders that really hear in their own disturbing words, how they talk about victims and how they did what they did. And I just thought that was such an asset to the book, and I think it's about time that Anne's story gets told.
Absolutely, and within the book, there is a really good balance for whether you're a professional or not. The book is a good read. Professionals in the field would find it immensely interesting. Finding out, reading about the development of this profiling and the processes that you set in place, as well as, of course, the cases themselves that were originally profiled.
We began talking. His office is just floor below mine, and we talked cases. And pretty soon it was decided, well, let's see if we can't talk about your career as a forensic nurse, but then also your work with the FBI. So that's really what happened. I think she did a good job in terms of the way that she dealt with the material. I really liked watching her do that and bringing out the cases. I think were right on target.
And I don't know, Kathryn, if you're familiar. I assume you're familiar with the Crime Classification Manual. And what edition is it in now?
Third.
Any plans for fourth? A lot of work, I bet.
Hey, how fast do you think I can write? Jeepers.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Anne Burgess and Dr. Gary Brucato. Welcome. We have been given a wonderful opportunity, and because you've written this book, to have a conversation about it today. So tell us why you wrote the book, how it came about, and the process of putting all that together.
Well, I think it came about in an interesting way. The material was always there. And I should say that it was a part of a project. It was a two-part project, but we never did the profiling part. We did the characteristics of the 36 serial killers. That was with the FBI. And we published that book in sexual homicide. But we never did anything. My career went on. The agents retired, and those. So we just never did anything until Mindhunter's Netflix came out. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize, I hadn't even seen it. And I started getting these requests from international places, Iceland, Greece, Italy. And they wanted, and I said, why do you want to talk to me? And they said, well, because your character is on Mindhunter. So I had to see it. So when I saw it, I had a lot of reactions to it because it was the cases we had done, et cetera, et cetera. So in the meantime, we invited John Douglas to come to Boston College. And in that process, getting really reconnected, I said to John, I really need to get some of this out. And because Stephen Constantine is our, for the School of Nursing, is our director of communications, and he's a writer. We began talking. His office is just floor below mine, and we talked cases. And pretty soon it was decided, well, let's see if we can't talk about your career as a forensic nurse, but then also your work with the FBI. So that's really what happened in terms of that. And the wonderful thing that Gary contributed to this is this was a whole new world. I had written textbooks, but never had written crime books. And so Gary very generously suggested that we contact his literary agent, Alice Martell. And that's what did it. Then that put us in with Hachette Publishing, and yet the result is Killer by Design.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I've read the book, obviously, and was gripped by so many different aspects of it, really. And as I'd said in the email to you, one of the aspects that really stood out with your book and with Gary's book, The New Evil, was just the compassion for the victims, because very often with true crime, that's lost.
That's right. But my work had been with victims. And that's exactly why the FBI had contacted me, is because it was at the time, this was in the late 70s, the women's movement was really pushing the whole issue of rape and doing something about it. In the meantime, the director of the FBI, William Webster, had said, we have to have our academy teaching on rape investigation. And that was assigned to Roy Hazelwood, who was fairly new to the behavioral science unit. And Roy happened to be out in the West Coast doing a hostage negotiation class for the Los Angeles Police Department, and had kind of lamented that he had this new assignment. He didn't know anything about teaching about rape investigation. And one of the detectives came up to him afterwards. Now, she also was a nurse. So the connection with my career and with other nurses who are also in law enforcement has been really, really important. And so she told Roy that she had just read this article in American Journal of Nursing on the rape victim in the emergency room. And she said, she's on the East Coast, why don't you give her a call? And Roy did, and invited me down to lecture before the academy. And that's what happened. I kept doing it. They kept inviting me back. And then William Webster said, all of you instructors at the academy have to be doing research. You're an academy, we do research. And so they kind of were scrambling around to each one come up. There were only about 8 at the time in the behavioral science unit. And of course, in that group was Bob Ressler and John Douglas. And I listened to what they were doing. They were just doing these kind of interviews when they were out doing a road school and just talking with criminals, because Bob Ressler had said he had to teach criminal psychology, and how could he teach it if he hadn't talked to any criminals? And you forget that they don't do the interviewing up till that time. They were the investigators, so they'd never really talked with any of the suspects or anything. So this was a new experience for Bob. And then he started bringing John Douglas along. And I was fascinated with what their interviews were, but there was no organization to it. And that's the way that Dr. Wendy Carr portrays that meeting with them is pretty accurate, is really, really accurate. And I was really pleased that much of the Netflix content on the cases and so forth was pretty real. So that's how I said, I did say you got to get this published, and you got to publish it not to just law enforcement, get it out to the other disciplines. And I think I even did say, you really got a book here. And of course, that's what in the Netflix Mindhunter, that's what gets picked up. But that's really how it started. And so my job was not to be a profiler. I'm not a profiler, but to get the material organized in a way that made sense. And we had a couple of really, I think, important publications out of that, where we came up with the model. My advisory board, Carol Hartman, was really instrumental in this. She was psychoanalytic background, and she kind of really helped put those 4 phases together. And that was the model. How
many interviews had actually been done before you joined the team?
They had made a list of 82 killers. And from the 82, we went through them to see who the agents could get in to see. And that was narrowed down to 36. Now, all of them were not serial killers, but they were all sexual killers. The majority were serial killers, but like Dwayne Samples had only 2, and of course 1 survived. But it was really important what he had to say about his background in terms of developing these fantasies and so forth. And several others only had 1 or 2. At that time, remember, we thought that had to have 3 or more to be called a serial killer. They've since revised that. So out of the 36, the majority, I think over 24, 25 were serial killers. And most of them you all would know by their names.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of them.
They're pretty infamous by this stage, aren't they?
Yeah.
So obviously, I read in your book that your colleagues at the time had said, don't do it. It's going to be a career ender. There was quite a lot of overt sexism at that time. So just talk me through the process of how you dealt with that and, any barriers that you came up against.
Well, that was tough because by then I was an academic. I didn't start out wanting to be an academic. I just wanted to be a therapist, a nurse psychotherapist, but kind of got pulled in to teach at Boston College. But there were very little support in nursing. This isn't what nurses do, they would say. You're never going to make a career talking about rape, good heavens, or talking about crime. You're just not going to do it. So how did I do it? Well, there were certainly some that were interested in it. And so there was a group. But I think the other important thing is when I was invited down to University of Pennsylvania, which is a very different school from Boston College, the dean there, Claire Fagan, was a very far visionary leader. And I have since talked with her about, how come she was so supportive. And she said, I learned early that someone with a good idea, I'd let them go ahead with it. I didn't want any good idea not to have its chance. And that was her motto. That was how she built an incredible nursing school at University of Pennsylvania. So the lesson from that is you've got to have people that are supportive of you, because I'm not sure I would have stayed with it if I didn't have that, because I had to have a career, right? I had to be a nurse. Yeah. So, but that I would say there, and because of the FBI project, it was so interesting and so compelling that I wanted that material to get out, and I focused on the victim. And that, I think, is what I contributed to the agents who had no interest, it's not fair to say no interest, but no focus on victims. They just had to find that suspect, the killer. So, but that's all they have in a homicide is the victim, right? So they now, and I think Criminal Minds even did this, they start with the victim. Outside, crime scene, of course, but the victim. And a lot of people, detectives, investigators don't do that. They just focus in on crime or the weapon or the forensics or whatever. And they really need, that's where I say those that were trained by Ressler and by Douglas, I call them Ressler trained or Douglas trained, they really have their own way of doing profiling. And I'm not sure it's like other investigators with in law enforcement do it that way. But I think that's why they were so successful, and they were incredibly successful. And our task was, how to write it up.
Yeah, and you talked in your book about how they were much more focused on gut instinct in investigations than considering the psychology of it. So was there much resistance to the idea of bringing psychology into investigations?
Oh, yes. They didn't want psychology in investigation because I remember Douglas saying to me, Anne, how do I go out and find someone that's got an Oedipus complex? He's right, So we had to find someone. Now, that's all very interesting after the fact, and studying it after the fact. But they needed this. That's why the behavior was so important. What could you see in the crime scene? What did it tell you about how old the criminal was, or how tall he was, or what kind of a vehicle did he drive? Or those are the kinds of things they needed to go after a suspect. So we didn't put that first. And a lot of people, I think, put that first, but we put the behavior of the criminal first. And what could you find in the crime scene and location and all of that, all the inputs, as we call it, that would get you focused better in on where to help a local law enforcement look. Because local law enforcement had a whole list of suspects. They would always have suspects. What can you do with 25 suspects? if you don't have some, look for this type of, he's going to be this gender and he's going to be this race and he's going to have worked and or not worked, all of those kinds of things, or live with his parent or not live with his parents, or be married or divorced. All of those are what they would come up with.
So all of these aspects that you came up with by looking at the crime scene, were they to definitively define the offender, or were they more to reduce a list of suspects?
No, they weren't. It wasn't definitive. They worked as a team. And when you would watch them, and that's where we had so many of the sessions actually typed up, is they would go back and forth. And Roy would say, well, I think this. Or Russell would say, no, I really think it's more of this. Or he's only like in his early 20s. And somebody else would say, no, he looks like he's more mid-20s. And they would work it back and forth until they got consensus. So it was really a team effort. And that's what I tried to capture and to show how, even though they came up with the same answer, they came at it from a different angle. And I had to figure out, well, why were they from a different angle? Well, it had everything to do with their background and what their experience had been, which is what we all in our own fields do, of course, right? So that's what I really tried to do. And I think if people don't take a team approach when they have a really tough case, that's where they may lose a lot of things. So that team effort and just watching them sitting around this big table with all the crime scenes sitting out was really impressive. And I would have to keep saying, well, what about the victim? I would keep pulling to the victim. Yeah.
So then you came up with that. Sorry, Gary. You came up with the structure then of these stages of profiling. How successful were different types of people or different detectives able to replicate that?
Well, there's where you're on to. That's the tough question. Is we weren't. You can't. Can you really teach this? That was what we always struggled with. It was one thing for that whole unit to be working on cases, but could you then take it out to the field and teach? And so what they came up with, instead of that, they put profilers, what they call coordinators, in every major FBI office across the country. And so when a case would come in, that profiler coordinator was able to pull together all of the materials and then get the group in, so that they use the same model, if you will, and then as much as possible would call into Quantico and still get input from Douglas or Ressler. Or we had in the book, you notice we had second generation, third generation, that we really tried. That's about as far as I went with them, or before both John and Ressler retired, is to get up to the third generation. And we're pretty successful. And if you've ever talked with Ken Lanning or Judd Ray or Gary Cooper, they're wonderful in terms of how well they were trained. I don't know about after that, but I can certainly go to the third generation. I think, Gary, you have something to say?
Yeah.
Well, I was just saying, it's very easy to overlook the enormous contributions that were made by Anne and her group to forensic psychology, to really, even though the effort was to stay objective and so forth, the work yielded a tremendous amount that we use, people like Kathryn, you and I use in our work. I mean, first and foremost, this enormous insight that arose from the work with Linda Holstrom, that that seemingly sex-related crimes were really about power and domination as an expression of that need, as opposed to sex, where you're seeing sex crimes. And that work really carried over into the FBI, conceptualization of these kinds of crimes, so that they came to understand that in many ways the abnormal gratification that was being satisfied in these acts, even when they weren't overtly sexual, really, had a lot to do with the stuff that Anne had been unearthing with Linda. That these were different sort of strange expressions of sexual needs and psychological needs. And secondly, I think the work that was done really, once people were apprehended and you can interview them, Anne had helped to develop this fantastic instrument, this really rich instrument for asking questions, really guiding in a structured way, that yielded such a treasure trove of information that ultimately they wound up realizing that these individuals who go on to commit serial killing, for example, have these long-standing fantasies about domination and control that go all the way back to childhood and then ultimately are enacted in some spectacular, horrifying way later in life. Perhaps because of some event that's stressful or some, or alcohol consumption or drug use or something else. And then you see this kind of repetitive playing out of the fantasy over and over again, in a sort of strange attempt to perfect it, like a kind of an art form for some of these people. And, I think it's just so easy to miss that those things, which are so fundamental to our understanding of serial homicide, really came out of this work. And I think in that sense, you really start to understand that group pioneered so much of it, and among them, so much of what we understand about these offenders. And I think that really did influence profiling and capturing of people and probably saved lives.
Absolutely. And I know for a fact that I wouldn't be sat here today doing the job that I do if it weren't for that work. Because if your work and with the FBI had never have developed into anything, across in the UK, this wouldn't have developed into anything. Nobody was really doing anything related to psychology and crime. So it has been the grounding of so much work around the world.
Well, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because one of the first non-American groups that they reached out to them was your Scotland Yard. And I know the agents would go over periodically to give lectures. I even went over with the New Scotland Yard and lectured on victims and so forth. So your country was certainly very much interested in what we were doing.
And I think going back to what Gary's just said about, this sort of pioneering work of looking at the offender and their background and a really good understanding of how their psychology led them to offend. And I don't think it had really sort of was that clear in my mind before I read your book, the idea that this childhood trauma for serial sexual offenders was an enactment with them as the control, with them with the power, abusing other people then. So it was, that this reenactment caused by whatever trigger it was caused by.
Right. And that's really, really important. And from a standpoint of prevention, that's really what we should be focusing on with young people, is to be sure that that's picked up early, that those fantasies and that the way of thinking and so forth, that's because it started so young. Mm-hmm. That's what really surprised me. And that was verified. We were able to verify. We had access to all of the pediatric records and so forth. So we felt pretty safe in talking about the importance of the early trauma. And even today in some of my work, when I interview someone for a homicide, I have to find out where that thinking started. And you go right back to childhood. It's going to be there somewhere. Mm-hmm. The problem is accessing it. Your question about does everyone have one an early? And I would have to say yes. The problem is accessing it and finding out how are we training young people, mental health as well as law enforcement, to know how to ask the right questions and to get to that information.
Right. I think even today there's such an underfunding of supporting victims of trauma that there are still people missed, who go on to become adult offenders. Yeah.
Well, we have a terrible case here a couple of weeks ago. Gary can certainly speak to it, where a 15-year-old had taken a gun to school and shot multiple of his classmates. And the information that's even public, let alone what isn't public, is that he had even been brought in by his parents to the school And the school knew that he had drawn a picture, I think it was, Gary, if you correct me if I have it right. But I had a picture and said, stop these. I can't stop these thoughts. Help me, help me. And what did they do? They let him go into the classroom. And then he acted out the fantasy. Unbelievable. I don't, Gary, if you want to comment on that case.
No, I mean, I think, it sort of takes us into the realm of mass murder, which is really quite, in many ways, a different beast from serial killing. And, one of the things I would say, so that it doesn't go missed, I think is very important, is, and it's a point that I raised in the New Evil, in the introduction, is that part of the problem with the change in the definition of serial killing is that in the original conceptualization, not only did you need the 3 victims or more, right, separated, with the cooling off period, but the idea was that the killing was, quote, in the service of abnormal psychological gratification. So that now a person can be considered a serial killer who, let's say, goes into a deli and shoots the owner to rob them, and then 2 months later robs a gas station and kills the owner. They're a serial killer, right? 2 victims separated in time and no need for psychological gratification. So that I think the essence of the serial killer in its original conceptualization was exactly this stuff that Anne was getting at, right? That this playing out of some psychological need over and over again. And I think that, especially in the way a lot of people think about profiling based on television and movies and so forth, things like The Silence of the Lambs and so forth, is that it's this notion that you could look at the crime scene and sniff out that abnormal gratification that's being served by the killing, and then it will give away the offender, that you're sniffing out the motive that way. But in many ways, that's not accurate, right? I mean, certainly if you're looking for signature elements and things like that, it gives you clues. Right. But you have to separate out in your mind that from the police level of things, really the point is to be kind of Sherlockian and really detect in a concrete way what you can tell about a person physically and what you could tell about them, in terms of their demographics and so forth. But I think things get very interesting once you know the offender and you can start saying, hey, look at that right there out in the open was a clue to this psychological gratification. And that's where I think, people like you and me, Kathryn, get really interested is thinking about things like, why this weapon instead of that weapon? What was the psychological symbolism of it? Is there a reason all these victims physically look alike? What need was being served by the habits that were formed by that individual? How did it mirror their childhood situation and how they seem to be leveling the playing field through the action? And I think that stuff is absolutely fascinating. I can tell you the psychology of people who do things like commit mass murder really seems to be quite a different thing, perhaps worthy of its own session, because I had been one of the co-creators with Dr. Rocky Burgess of the Columbia Mass Murder Database, as I understand it, the largest globally. And we looked at mass murder from 1900 to 2019. There was something like 1,700 cases of mass murder. And we're in the process now of analyzing the distinct motives to drive mass murder. But this whole thing of repeatedly killing because of a psychological need is very different, very, very different animal. And I think that's where Anne's work really shines, is illuminating that stuff. Wouldn't you say, Anne, that the notion of the abnormal psychological gratification is just so key to what a serial killer really is?
Yeah, I would agree with that. We also had one of the serial killers that it wasn't enough just to kill one at a time. He had plans to go on and do a mass killing. So,
very interesting.
I know. So that's another thing to look at.
I think it's a lot easier for people like me. For me, what I do with Crime Psych, I look at cases in retrospect. We already know who the offender is. We already know what they've done. And so it's a lot easier to look at a case from, retrospective point of view than to what you were doing is having no information, and developing these profiles, which is incredible.
Yeah, and that's true. You would just get and the agents would do that just to listen to them. That's all they were doing. They were on the phone all the time with people calling in and say, help me with, well, what do? We have this problem, we have that problem. And being able to direct them in a way that there was no, it was incredible, I think, to see this. And that's back to your original question, that's really what I wanted to try to get written down from a history standpoint, if you will, of the beginning of profiling.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, you write about this process and the instruments you use to come up with these things. Have they been continued to be used in the FBI today?
Well, they're used in terms of they have the profile coordinators and they have the cases coming in, and they, of course, can still call on Douglas or any of the second or third generation profilers. I mean, I've asked them all, and they certainly keep up their expertise. And but how well they're doing it, I don't know. We've had some interesting cases, just say in the last year, where I think they. Well, from a public standpoint, I'm only looking what's in the newspaper, but they've missed something, that we're not getting out the education that really needs to be done to agencies. I think that we just need to keep pushing on education and shows. I think that's one of the reasons that your shows are so popular, is mm-hmm. that people need this information. They need it not only just for their own education, but also to help in if you will, trying to get some solving of these crimes. Look at, how many cold cases we have? We have, say, hundreds each year, and only half get solved. No, half of homicides here in the States get solved. So if you have 300 homicides, you're only solving 150. And each mm-hmm. year that just gets added on and on and on. That's why we have a group that's looking at cold cases to try to help not only identify a suspect, but also for the families, because nothing is worse than these families that have a family member killed and then the case is dropped and nobody seems interested anymore. I mean, we've received information just on that alone. I remember one woman who's now in her 30s, and she was only 10 when her mom was killed. And she was so glad that at least people were still interested in trying to find out who did it. Mm-hmm. So that's another whole area to get into, is that whole cold case issue.
Yeah. And I think that's where basing future research off what you started is so important, I think, because we've really got to start blending more so, I think, understanding crime from a detective's point of view and from a psychologist's point of view, because sometimes it seems as though we're looking out of different windows at the same problem, and we've got the detectives looking at it from, one angle, and then psychologists looking at crime and behavior from a completely different angle. And I think there needs to be more conversations to develop this and to bring it on forward.
Yeah, very important. I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely.
It's been such a pleasure to work with Anne's group at Boston College, where I'm now a visiting scholar and part of the forensic group with Anne and Dr. Victor Petrecka and a marvelous troupe of students and other experts. And, what we're really in many ways doing is sort of trying to blend these different insights when we're looking at various forms of crime that we look at. And also in the work that Michael Stone had started, that I worked on with him in the New Evil, if you really think about it, if you sort of take the whole evil concept off the table, in many ways, the continuum presented in that book is a series of psychological profiles, motivational profiles. And in many ways, it attempts to do what you're talking about, taking objective behavior and trying to say, if you do these things in the checklist, you fall into this bucket, and people in this bucket have the following things in common psychologically. It has some promise if if it were to be empirically validated, it could be very useful if we're correct, about those categories, for being able to work in reverse the way we're talking about, the way that psychology might teach us to do. So that, for example, people who engage in torture as serial killers might be different than serial killers who only commit sexual assault with no torture, or different, or where there are psychotic elements or so forth, and or different degrees of personality disturbance. So I think we're trying, but easier said than done. Easier said than yeah.
I think that leads us nicely into thinking about profiling from all three of our perspectives. I'm from a psychological background with empirical data sets, statistically proven phenomenon, and then applying that to crime and criminal behavior. And, then, Anne, you develop these profiles with some understanding, with a good understanding of psychology, and then trying to adapt that for detectives. And Gary, what you did with your book in The New Evil was, as you rightly say, we categorize these cases based on behavior. And I think that's really important for developing these profiles and making them, being able to replicate these consistently over time. Was the FBI profile setup able to be statistically tested and replicated?
Well, we certainly did in the criminal personality study. We had a statistician on who has really gone on and is quite famous in his own work. So we felt pretty good that we had him when he was just really starting his career. But he took the information on these data sheets as they were entered and was able to come up with, and I think it's in the book, or at least it was in the sexual homicide book, they divide up either organized, disorganized, and we had a category of mixed, and Ralph really pushed us. We could not have a mixed group. We had to push it into either organized or disorganized. And I know that is still the way a lot of the detectives and so forth look at crime scene. But then came up with the characteristics that seem to be more likely than not to be correct. And I think that is what had helped them move this along. And it was statistically done. I know that we're all holding our breath until Ralph was able to run the numbers and say, yes, that this is holding up. So, and it's hard because behavior and trying to put the answers into a schema, a questionnaire, if you will, was not easy. And we tried our best. It was very early. We were really hypothesis generating, not hypothesis testing. And I know that you are much more into the hypothesis testing, but we were just generating hypotheses because it hadn't been studied well enough to be able to come up with hypotheses. And I know that was a criticism even back with my rape study with Linda Holmstrom. And we had to say over and over, this is hypothesis generating. We don't know enough about the rape victim and so forth and what happens. We can't get into your more sophisticated testing of hypotheses. And people didn't understand that. And so we were, as I said, heavily criticized because we didn't have a control group. We didn't have this. We didn't have that. And we didn't intend to.
Cookbook, right?
Yeah, right. So it was more important to get the pattern and the descriptive pattern. And then the others, we said, those that come along after us can go ahead and test out the hypothesis.
So that mixed group that you were talking about, that mixed category sitting in between the organised and disorganised, a lot of academics jumped on that and said, well, you can't have a mixed one. How can you possibly derive characteristics from this mixed pot in the middle?
Yeah.
So how can you?
Well, that's exactly what Ralph said, because he was a statistician. He said just exactly what you said, almost was what he would say. But and we had to make a decision. But that mixed group, what we've learned since is that in there, if you look over, say you take someone that's had 5, 6, 7 murders, and you look over all of them, you can find that there are certain things that happen within the commission of a crime that is not going to be neat and clean and statistically set. So the escalation factor, don't forget, kits in there. We tried to have each of the murders or the victims, we tried to get that for each of the victims and classify that, and it was very, very hard. The data were very slim. There were a lot of missing data, and we just didn't dare go beyond the pattern part. So I have to say we certainly did and published those factors that we felt that were statistically correct, but left a lot for future researchers to do.
You know, and Kathryn, it's very interesting because in some of the work that the forensic group is doing, that Ann and I are part of, where we look at things like dismemberment, mutilation as an act, which Ann and I and Michael Stone helped to define, to delineate the definitions of mutilation and dismemberment in the literature. You know, what we start to understand when we look at psychology and motivation is that what looks like mixed elements in a crime scene may be reflective of different motivations. For example, somebody may, in an organized way, kill someone, but then butcher a body to eliminate traceable, evidence, identification, things like that. So you see things like removal of eyes and teeth and skin and tattoos and so forth. And you might say, wow, what a disorganized, chaotic scene, what a butcher and so forth. But it may be that you're missing the point that actually it's an organized thing to do in a strange way, because you're eliminating evidence. So that I think, again, it gets to that need to bridge motive and the objective that you're observing. And so, it speaks to that urgency again.
There are so many aspects of a crime being committed that you can examine, from the crime scene or, information that you can get from the victims, that drawing out what is going to be useful and what isn't going to be useful, even now is incredibly difficult. How can we start to overcome the fact that when there is a crime scene and aspects of a victim that we can examine, there is so much information there, what's useful and what's not. Right. And is there a way that we can separate these, what's useful and what's not useful?
Well, that's always the big question is what is useful and what isn't useful. And a lot is going to depend on what the person brings to the actual case that they're looking at, and how do they. I'm always interested in how someone approaches you can give the same case and look at 5 people or 4 people from different views and see how they approach it. And it can all be different, but you all may come up with the same answer. So something in our ability to sift through information from our experience comes forward. And that seems to be what happens. That's why I like teaching so much, because you can present this case, just the facts of the case, and then see how the students do. I think the other important breakthrough that we've had in the whole crime field has been the forensics piece. And I try to emphasize that because look at how many cases are coming up where they've got the wrong person, and the forensics has actually shown that. And we have to be so careful not to put the wrong person in. And I don't know about in your country, but we've had a number of cases where the exoneration issue is amazing, that we've missed it, and it's been bias. But I think if we have to really look at one real culprit here, is the bias that people come to with this. And I think that the reason that the sexual homicide or sexual field is so hard is so many people see this as sex, and it isn't. It's the power, it's the dominance. I just had a couple of cases in another country where the judge let the person off because it was a nursing home case, and he couldn't imagine a young man who would be interested in raping a elderly person in a nursing home. Now that's a bias, because the evidence showed that he did. And the judge tried to say, well, he must have just been, he just must have breathed on the person, I think he said. And that's how they got the DNA on the woman's chest or something. So,
Wow.
This is now what, 2021?
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah. It was Australia.
Wow. I mean, when I'm talking to people about criminal psychology, they just can't begin to imagine how somebody could commit such an atrocious act,
Right.
towards another person. There's a book by Jack Katz, which looks at the pleasurable aspects of crime, and people don't want to touch that. We don't want to examine that. We don't want to bring it out into the forefront. But there is sometimes a pleasurable aspect of committing these offences for the offender, isn't there?
Well, a lot of times, yeah. I don't think just a few. I think a lot of times there has to be something that they're getting out of it. Because it's a sexual crime, the erotic aspect has to be looked at. But there's also the thrill of being in power, of dominating someone, all of that, taking control. So there is absolutely, or they wouldn't keep repeating it.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, during our conversation, we've talked about some pretty gruesome, acts that some people have done, such as bludgeoning and dismemberment and things like that. And I've certainly been asked, and I'm sure you've been asked before as well, how do you deal with that? Does it keep you awake at night?
That doesn't keep me awake at night. If I am asked about that, what keeps me awake is trying to get the case solved. That's what keeps me awake. What did I miss? Let me go over this again. That's the kind of thing. Or what I get the books out. Maybe there's something I can learn in one of the books that we've missed, but not the other. I don't know, Gary. Does that keep you awake at night?
No, I mean, I think that, there is a certain kind of splitting mechanism that, serves well when people have to deal day in and day out with some of these gruesome things. But I think, like you, Ann, I take a kind of clinical distance from it. And I see that, somebody has to do this kind of work to ultimately save lives. I mean, at the risk of, a grandiose tone there, I do think that ultimately that is the goal of this work. And that is what is lost, I think, when people are drawn to forensic psychology, forensic psychiatric nursing, and other fields because of the sensational, titillating aspects. They've totally lost sight of the fact that the only reason you're talking to the offender and examining their writings and their artwork at their crime scenes and so forth is not that you are fascinated by their artistic output or self-expression for its own end, but that ultimately it is a pathway to saving lives. And
Right.
As an example of this, yesterday was, unless I'm very much mistaken, the 44th anniversary of when Ted Bundy escaped from prison and went on to kill, right? December 30th, 1977. And I bet that if you went out into the street and you polled people and said, who's Ted Bundy? You would find that the vast majority of people would have heard of him. He's sort of an anti-heroic, kind of bad guy that has become almost a Mephistophelian character instead of a person that existed. And but I would also bet that virtually no one would be able to name one single victim of Ted Bundy.
Yeah.
And and when you really understand that, it's heartbreaking. There is video footage, for example, that you can easily find on YouTube of the mother of Denise Naslund, one of the victims, talking about the heartbreak of wondering every night of her life, what happened to my daughter? What was going through her mind when she was with Ted Bundy? What did he make her do? I need to know what was going through her head at that moment. And you can see that she was decimated by this for the rest of her life. And you start to understand that the victims of these offenses are not only the people killed, but those around them who have to think, my God, this is my child, my grandchild, my friend, my colleague. And then you really start to understand that these people that are getting this weird praise or, that are objects of fascination are nothing more than people who, because of their own selfish need, their own psychological need, randomly pluck people out of society and destroy their lives. And sometimes do things to them like torture them, in ways that are unfathomable, or humiliate them, or objectify them totally. So there is a little bit of a kind of a disgust that I think, it sounds like all three of us share, for that tendency to do that kind of aggrandizing of these offenders. I think is so, so much at the heart of why I've always been drawn to Anne's work, and part of why when Michael and I did The New Evil, I specifically reached out to Anne to do the afterword for the book, because I thought, it would set a tone for what we valued in the. And one other thing that I've always admired about Anne's work that just gets missed sometimes is the enormous contribution of the co-authorship of the Crime Classification Manual. And the Crime Classification Manual was intended, as I understand it, as almost like an analog to the DSM in psychiatry. In fact, Anne, unless I'm mistaken, when you and your husband Alan and Robert Ressler and John Douglas created that book, isn't it true that you were meeting with some of the people from the DSM committees to talk about the possibility of merging them? I mean, that's a fact that I think is easily missed. And talk about, Kathryn, things that we don't have the validation process going on like you do with the DSM, right? The DSM, you have field studies that lead to total revisions of the nosology of mental illness. But in the Crime Classification Manual, I think, unless I'm very much mistaken, and there's sort of a sore need to sort of like further delineate those categories with empirical data more and more and more. And but they're very interesting and useful, particularly the motivational subtypes of rape, the cases where you have a secondary element, like you're committing a felony and then you commit a rape and as a sort of an opportunistic thing alongside the other offense, mass murder, spree killing, serial killing, etc. And so many of those things have slipped into our vocabulary as forensic experts that, we might not realize that, a lot of that stuff was laid out by people who were putting together this nosology. Right. And I don't know, Kathryn, if you're familiar, I assume you're familiar with the Crime Classification Manual. And what edition is it in now, Anne?
Third.
Third? Any plans for fourth? A lot of work, I bet.
How fast do you think I can write? Jeepers. You're absolutely correct, as that was designed to model it after the DSM, because mental health has multiple disciplines and they have to communicate. And so we thought, well, that's what law enforcement does too, and law enforcement wants to communicate, so let's see if we could model it. And we did form the task groups and they worked on it, and that's what the first and second and third edition, but you're right. It probably should be updated, but I don't think I'm going to do it. I'll let you.
Wonderful. I use it often. I understand. Yeah. But there's quite a bit of psychology to it, Kathryn, because there are a lot of motivational subtypes in there.
Yeah. No, there is. I also want to point out for Kathryn the stress that these profilers are under. You can't imagine. They had all kinds of medical issues, not necessarily ever noted, and I don't want to call them psychosomatic, but it was a lot of stress. And they had the stress because they were the FBI and they were supposed to get it right, and the pressure from the upper echelons, et cetera, et cetera. So this work is not easy. And anytime, I think any police officer will tell you that anytime there's a homicide in their community, is there's such pressure to get it solved. So keep that in mind.
And that's not very well communicated in the media either, is it? The media gives off this sexy image of, almost magical, sort of problem solving and crime solving.
Right. Yeah,
that's one of the reasons why I came into this profession. You're going to laugh at me now. Was because I wanted to be Clarice Starling in Silence of the Lambs, and I was disappointed at first to learn actually that's not what it is. But what I found was so much more interesting, and I would like there to be more in the media, about this side of things, because it's not well communicated enough.
No, it needs to be in the media. Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the groups that's so strong for the crime kinds of slows are women, you know. I think it's almost 80% of followers for this are women. So we need to get our female power behind it all, Kathryn.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting point. I mean, anytime, Ann and I and other people, we're asked to do things like, documentary appearances or things like that. You're often told that, there's need for other experts that are female, right? That to be there because there's such a dearth of females in the field, and there's a disproportionate balance where the viewers and readers of true crime, they're mostly female, and I think it speaks to the fact that women are disproportionately affected by crime. And so many types of crime, that is to say, such as sexual assault and so forth. So that there's really an investment in really wanting to understand what's going on with these offenders and to see justice done and to vicariously experience closure. I think when you see some of these cases solved and your own hasn't been, or there's been no closure on your own assault or other experience. So, but it's definitely true. And, I have to say it's been such a wonderful thing. And in our forensic group at Boston College to see how many young women there are in the group that aspire to doing this work. It's really wonderful. Do you have that same experience in the UK, Kathryn?
Absolutely. Yeah. When I was doing my PhD, there were about 10 or 11 females and one male, and in fact, the majority of the department were females. There was one male, there was David Cantor leading it all, and I think that has changed and evolved with time, because women have become more empowered and there is less sexism now. So I would like to see that continue.
Right.
Well, it's very interesting, Kathryn, because you mentioned The Silence of the Lambs. And, I know when people watch that movie or read the book, there's this sort of understanding that the character of Jack Crawford, the head of the FBI, is very John Douglas-like, right? You sort of get the sense that he was in many ways a basis for. But I think it's also easily missed that in many ways, whether it was conscious or not, the character of Clarice Starling as this lone female in the agency there, going out and hunting mines, is sort of Ann Burgess-like, right? And we talked about that. No one ever I've never heard it mentioned. Yeah. And I don't know, if that's an accident, but if you want to be like Clarice Starling, I think you'd have a career an awful lot.
I'm talking to Clarice right there.
Right, exactly. So it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Okay, so I asked some of my followers if they wanted to ask you any questions, Anne. And do you think there are more bad people in the world than good?
No, I don't think there are more bad than good. I think there are a lot of good people and they want to do things. I mean, that's been my experience. And so, no, I don't think there are more.
I've had similar experiences. I was working with a large police data set from a major city in the UK. And once I got into that data set and I really started to look at who was doing what, it was a very small minority of offenders committing most of the crimes in that area.
Yes, I think I would agree. I think that's what we're seeing over here. Yes.
I choose to believe there are more good people than bad. Absolutely. Yeah. So do you think some people are just born bad?
No, I don't think some people are born bad. I think that they're more in the nurture piece than the nature piece. And that's where we need to put more of our emphasis, is to help with the development of the child. Because there's so much that working against the child with what the social indicators are. And that's what Essence is in Gary and Michael Stone's book on the New Evil. It's really what they get into, the cultural changes that we've had since the 1960s. So that's where I think we need to put a lot of emphasis, is the development of the child. Would you agree, Gary?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think getting right to the heart of the question, are there more bad people? I think, a little slant on the question is the average person a little bit more disinhibited and kind of primitive now because of cultural changes? And I think the answer is probably. So that in the kind of soup of the lack of black and white forms of identity that one used to see in the period before postmodernism, like where people were more drawn to traditional ways and norms and things for whatever they were worth. They had a kind of glue effect to them. And more, the other thing is I think that you start to see a lot of a coarsening of the culture, right? And you certainly saw with the liberation of women, the 1960s onward, this sort of pathetic backlash on the part of certain little working class men, I think, in the form of an explosion of sexual violence toward women. And it must have been cultural, because when you go back even a few decades to where we have very good records in newspaper articles and so forth, you just don't see the same degree of it. And it was committed for very different reasons. The sexual motivation for serial killing was a lot rarer prior to the 1960s, and it had a kind of so-called golden age, although I dislike the term, from the 1960s to the 1990s. And I think the other point about, are people born, or, I think, psychopathy, which is at the heart of so much of this stuff, it's a very complicated puzzle, but we know there are certain brain areas that seem to be involved, right? Amygdala, frontal cortex, so forth. But it's interesting, we don't know if what we're seeing is the effects of trauma, right? If the brain has actually been changed by experience, or if the person is born that way, because we're not really putting these individuals in in an MRI at birth, right? There's very little work being done. That one person I would certainly highlight, if your readers are interested, is the work of Abby Marsh in Washington, D.C., who is doing a longitudinal study from childhood on of kids who have signs of psychopathy, and doing MRI work and identifying brain areas that seem to be changing, watching it longitudinally. And I think that work is extraordinarily promising.
Yeah, and I'm sure all three of us would agree that there aren't enough resources being targeted before a person becomes an offender, supporting them through childhood, supporting families, and developing their social skills, as they're growing up. It's a huge, huge hole that needs input. Right. Carl wants to know what percentage of time can a profiler be right in what they're saying?
Go ahead, Gary.
Oh, no. I think it's a great question. I just chuckling because it really is quite a clever. So what do you think of that, Anne? What would you say?
I would say they get it right. Certainly more likely get it right than not. So I'll go with that as a marker at this point, at least over half the time, and probably even higher. And they do keep track of that. They did do a study of that back, I think, around in the 80s, and they were doing really pretty good back then. And the other point I'd make is you have to know who's training them. And it's so important of who the mentor, who the trainer is. And so even to look at it nowadays, I don't know. But I know that it was pretty good, certainly back in the 90s and just starting into 2000.
With behavior in general, we're humans and we're inconsistent. We can change depending on so many slight aspects of our day-to-day lives that I think it would be absolutely impossible to get it right 100% of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. You can't. No discipline does that, right? We're not.
No. Certainly not. No. But I think it's clear that it's more than the 50-50 you would see if something was just totally random. Yeah. We'd also, I think, be remiss in not pointing out that there's a group we work with, a wonderful group led by Terrence Leary down in Florida, that's created, that works with Radford and Florida Gulf Coast universities, called the Serial Killer Database. And that database, which has collected thousands of data points across the lifespan of serial killers, is really trying to put, some empirical wind in the sails of, what we think about serial killers, and is already, and I had the great fortune of having some of that data to lay out in Evil, is really helped to explode some myths about serial killers, right?
Yeah.
That give us a sense of how they really authentically operate, the weapons they tend to favor, gender differences, victimology information, all kinds of myths about the relationship between race and motive, and race and certain types of offenses. And I think that should be right up your street, as they say, Kathryn, right? I mean, that's really where I think you light up when there's empirical data available.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's just because of the background that I come from. I'm sure that there are many, many academics who would absolutely have a meltdown if they came face to face with an offender, with a serial killer. It's just data sets, it's numbers. That's it. That's what we're dealing with the majority of the time. So to know that lives depend on you getting it right has got to be immense, immensely stressful, I think. Right. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. It's been so interesting. Is there any other points that anybody wants to bring up before we wrap it up?
Well, I think you've covered it very well. I can't think of any. Gary, you have any?
I would just end by saying that Anne's book is one heck of a read. I've got to tell you, everyone I've gotten the book for, I gave it to some people as Christmas present, and they came back and said I couldn't put that book down. It was really it's because it really draws you in. It's very well written and informative, and one of the things I love is the inclusion of transcript from offenders that really hear in their own disturbing words, how they talk about victims and how they did what they did. And I just thought that was such an asset to the book, and I think it's about time that Anne's story gets told.
Absolutely, and within the book, there is a really good balance for whether you're a professional or not. The book is a good read. Professionals in the field would find it immensely interesting, finding out, reading about the development of this profiling and the processes that you set in place, as well as, of course, the cases themselves that were originally profiled. Something for everyone. Loved it.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Oh, actually, that's what else I wanted to ask you about, because you were contacted because of this Mindhunter, on Netflix, the series, and they portrayed Dr. Wendy Carr as being a lesbian. How did you feel about that? Did they give a reason for that?
Well, I didn't realize that initially, and my son called me and said, "Mother, what haven't you told us?" So that's funny. That's how I said. I know that they're. I guess that it's what I guess Dr. Cantor would call the Hollywood effect. They had to make it. I guess it wasn't interesting enough without the backgrounds of these people, but they couldn't have gotten it more wrong on all three of us. The poor wrestler trying to say that he had this serial killer youngster at age 8 or something. They were almost making him was way off base. And of course they had John Douglas, just so different, as kind of this young, kind of not too organized, if you will, playing that character, but and then Wendy Carr. But I think she did a good job in terms of the way that she dealt with the material. I really liked watching her do that and bringing out the cases. I think were right on target. Well, they should have been on target because they had all of the transcripts. I think they could, so that they had what the offenders were saying. So, but anyway, that was kind of funny.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today then, Anne and Gary. And I will leave the links wherever I publish this to your book, Anne, and to your book as well, Gary. And yes, thank you for talking to me.
Well, thank you for asking us.
Maybe someday we'll collaborate, Ted.
There you go.
Absolutely. I'm on the plane right now. I've already booked my ticket. I'm on my way.
Very good
to have you.
Okay. Yeah, Kathryn, you need to get over to New Scotland Yard and give a lecture there. That would be good for you to do that. Have you ever done it?
No.
Oh, it'd be wonderful to have you do it. It's quite a lot of men over there. Not too many. Maybe now they have more women, but a lot of men. So
still not many though.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll tell you, Kathryn, you could dedicate an entire program just to some of the notorious British serial killers, some of the most horrendous, Sutcliffe, Ian Brady, Graham Young, the poisoner, except not to mention Jack the Ripper, if he was British, certainly active. But I tell you, it's a fascinating history of serial killing in your country, in your area there. So, all right. Thank you
There's
so much.
data for days on them.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you so much then.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye. Bye, Gary.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.